All right, folks, Dave Knuth here from Knuth Brewing Company. Welcome back to What's on Tap, Episode 2. I'm with my friend here, Lee Reiherzer, author, homebrewer, historian, right? What else you got?
That's about it. That's about all I have time for.
Cheers. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you started Oshkosh Beer, right?
Yeah,
I
started
the Facebook group.
Yeah, well, I started the blog in 2010.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you've got two books. We'll show the folks. Breweries of Oshkosh here.
So that came out in 2012.
2012.
Yeah.
And then this is the one I read, which is awesome. Winnebago County Beer.
2019.
2019.
Yeah.
And
then this one, yeah.
Yeah. All kinds of stuff. So this is for the SOBs, right?
Yeah, the Society of Oshkosh Brewers. So that's all homebrew recipes. So over the years, I've been, through doing research, I've come across these old recipes, and I've talked to some of the old brewers and stuff. So I knew I had enough to kind of get in there. And last year was the 175th year of brewing in Oshkosh. So I wanted to put together this recipe book that spanned all 175 years. So the earliest recipe in there is from 1850.
1850.
That brewer started in 1849.
Were they using cluster hops?
They were using cluster hops, yes, indeed, yeah. But it goes all the way up to the present, so that there's recipes in there from the three current breweries in Oshkosh, Fox River, Barebones, and Fifth Ward. Yeah.
So let's take it back. So you like me, I think, got started as a home brewer.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And now you've brewed. You told me a couple weeks ago. How many batches did you say you?
I think I'm up to 609 now.
And you have a log of every one.
Yeah, and it's weird because that's not the kind of thing. When I started home brewing, that's not the kind of thing I used to do. I didn't keep good records of anything. For some reason, with the very first recipe, I kept track of everything, and I never stopped. So I started out on paper, but now it's all digital. But I've still got folders just filled with,
What's your setup like?
So I've been through all kinds of stuff, and where I've settled in now, I'm kind of into process, So I had a system that was, I wouldn't say it was automated or anything, but it was a little upscale, I guess.
Yeah.
But I wanted something that was just very simple, because I like getting my hands in there. Because what I did for a living and stuff was always computer work, and it was nice having,
that's
being
what
part
hooked
of it.
me is creating something with your hands from scratch.
Totally. So I went back to like a more basic setup. It's infusion mash. I used to do a lot of decoction, and I got rid of all that stuff. But I brew mostly, almost 100% lagers.
Okay.
But when COVID started, I was like, okay, this is what it's going to be. So I just started brewing every week, and I never quit.
So you're still brewing every week?
Once a week I brew, yeah.
You don't have kids though, right?
No.
I always joke, because that's how I got started, was my father-in-law bought me a kit for my bachelor party.
Yeah.
And so, but I didn't have kids at the time. So I always say, like, if I had kids before I got that homebrew kit, I probably would not have a brewery. Because it just takes up so much time.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other, that makes everything that much more difficult.
Right. It's hard to tell your wife, all right, I'll be in the garage for 10 hours,
Right.
You got the kids.
I've got it down pretty well now where I can, so I break everything out so that I'm kegging a batch at the same time I'm brewing a batch.
Sure.
Because then I'm recycling yeast and it goes right in, everything's real good and fresh. So I can get it done in about 4 hours.
Wow.
Now. Yeah.
That's impressive.
It's a lot of work. It goes from one thing to the next. But
that's good.
I enjoy it. I love it.
Do you have a favorite beer? A favorite style?
So, like with this is all historic recipes and stuff like that, and I'm really into historic styles of beer. Yeah. So a lot of dark lagers, a lot of, malty German style beers, that kind of thing. And luckily that's what my wife likes to drink as well.
That makes it easier.
So it keeps everyone happy.
That's good. That's I love lagers too, and I love to me, like, and I was reading your book, with the culture of Wisconsin and the beer drinking culture, like, to me, beer is still cool. Like, it's still cool to make drinks out of just barley, hops, water, and yeast. Whatever the new craze is, the seltzers. Now they're doing THC stuff. Like, we kind of like I like good tasting beer that tastes like beer.
Yeah, well, the thing, and you look at your tap list, and it's all beer. It's not like, I mean, the idea where you're going to make a beer and then take buckets of fruit concentrate and dump it in there, you've kind of lost the path. And you've also at that point started training your customers not to really care for beer either.
Right.
So I mean, I as far as I'm concerned, I like beer, real beer. I like beer flavor. All this other stuff, I don't know if there's any future for it. People are doing what they think they need to do, so they're going to have to, to sustain their business. If they think that's what they have to do, then I guess they have to do it. But that's not where my interest lies.
I feel like, and we'll get to it, but there's some lessons from history, I think.
There's a lot of lessons.
I was skimming. I read your book a few years ago, but I was skimming this weekend just to kind of, and it's kind of interesting how things repeat themselves.
Yeah, I mean, when people turn away, in this history, when people turn away from their local market and what their people want, the people in their vicinity want, that's when things always just go downhill, And I think you've seen that with a lot of craft breweries, where especially, COVID forced people into distribution that they wouldn't have gotten into and things like that. And a lot of breweries just simply lost the thread,
Yeah. You got to take care of the people that take care of you.
Right. And, as a brewery, you want them to know you as a brewery.
Right.
So if all of a sudden you're all things to all people and you're making all these seltzers or infused products and all this, it's like, they're not coming to you as a brewery anymore. They're coming to you for something else. And when the next fad rolls around, they're going to be chasing that.
Then what happens, right? Yeah.
So
It's funny. So I wanted to talk, getting into the Winnebago County book. In the first part of the book, you mentioned how Winnebago County was really indicative of what brewing in Wisconsin was at that time. Not more so like in Milwaukee, the Schlitz and the Pabst and the Millers. That was kind of an anomaly, right?
Totally. If you look at Fond du Lac County, Winnebago County, that's what Wisconsin brewing really was. I mean, Milwaukee was always an outlier. From by 1860, something like 40% of the beer being made in Milwaukee was being sent to other states.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case in Fond du Lac County or
Sure.
Winnebago County. That was being drunk locally.
Yeah.
That was for a local audience, And if you look the kind of numbers those breweries were putting up, I mean, in Fond du Lac County, between Ripon, Fond du Lac, Waupun, by 1890, let's say 1900, there's probably 60,000 barrels of beer being brewed in that county a year, annually.
That's a lot of beer.
Oh, it's crazy.
I think people drank a lot more beer back then. Do you?
They definitely. I don't know if they did. There was. No, actually, they probably it's close.
It's
maybe
similar?
Slightly more. But
So
it's
how
not,
were they producing so much?
But because you didn't have 30 packs of hams on the shelf
Sure.
for $12,
Okay,
that kind of thing.
So they were whatever they were drinking was
They were drinking
their
local, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at beer prices over time, so up until 1960, the local beers were always at a lower price point than something like Pabst or Budweiser was.
Yeah. Yep.
And so until the 1960s, local beer was pretty strong still. Most of the beer sold in Winnebago County was brewed in Winnebago County. It wasn't
Sure.
coming in from other places. After the 1960s, when the breweries really started advertising heavily and trying to convince people that local beer wasn't as good as these beers that were being made in Milwaukee, which was anything but the truth.
Yeah.
But it works, that kind of advertising. That's when things turned around, and then also they started lowering their prices to compete.
Well, and then
with
those local breweries started trying to compete on price, right?
Yeah,
And
this was if you look at Berlin Brewery, in Oshkosh in 1962, Chief Oshkosh beer would be selling for $2.50 a case.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at that in inflationary, that's probably about a $20 case of beer. But
Okay.
$2.50 a case in 1962. Berlin would sell their beer for $2.10.
Sure.
But Pabst would be $3.35. So those
Interesting.
Those beers were more expensive.
Yeah.
But those small breweries, they were trying to compete on price, and economies of scale weren't in their favor.
There's no way you can do it.
Yeah.
In the brewing industry, it's
And it just
the same
kept-
thing as the automobile industry.
Yeah.
It's like
What's funny though is really in almost every one of these cases, whether it's Berlin Brewing Company or the breweries in Oshkosh, as long as they held that local market and they focused on that local market, they were okay. It's when they start going out of that local market,
Sure.
and they start putting money into distribution and stuff. And before long, people will buy those beers once or twice because they're unique or different. But then they'll return to whatever their other thing is. And when those distant markets fall off, those distribution markets, then all of a sudden they're paying all this money for distribution, and that's where they tend to get tripped up.
Yeah, so 3 of the breweries that stuck out in my mind in your book were the Rar Brewery.
Yeah, in Oshkosh.
Which they kind of went like the brew pub route.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
Like small brewery, but they had a bunch of different satellite locations.
Yeah, they had at one point. So the Rar Brewing Company was never a big brewery. I think, big's relative, but at their peak, they were doing about 20,000 barrels a year, which is
that's still a lot of beer.
Substantial amount of beer,
Yeah.
especially compared to what craft breweries tend to do today.
Yeah.
But and at that time they had something like 24 tied houses just in and around Oshkosh. So they were fine with that. They had offers like when there was another brewery that there was a brewery in Oshkosh that tried to buy them. They didn't want any part of it because they had this locked-in market. If you went to one of these taverns that the Rar family owned, the only beer you're going to get offered was Rar Brewing Company beer. So they did okay. Prohibition ended all that. After Prohibition, that kind of setup was illegal, and that's when those breweries like that size just could never compete.
And for those at home who don't know, so a tied house was a saloon that would only sell that.
It was tied to the brewery. That's where it comes from. Yeah,
and that was a big deal. Because
totally.
you had Pabst tied houses, you had Schlitz tied houses in Oshkosh, right?
Yeah.
They were competing.
Yeah,
that was the game.
Oshkosh was a weird city, because it was. Oshkosh always had a really high consumption rate. So
you said you had this. I think it was almost.
It was almost
2.5.
Yeah. It was
30 gallons to 13 gallons.
Right. It was off the charts.
Yeah.
So these breweries.
It still's pretty good, right?
it's from what I can tell. I'm holding up my end. But, these breweries would see this and we got to get something going there.
Sure.
So they all kind of, Pabst, Schlitz, Miller. It's a brewery from Cincinnati. There's a bunch of breweries set up distribution points and bought tied houses in Oshkosh, which led to the merger of 3 of Oshkosh's largest breweries to form the Oshkosh Brewing Company.
Yep.
And then they were able to beat all that competition down.
Sure.
But yeah, there was a lot of competition from outside breweries in Oshkosh.
It's funny because I think you still see that today with out-of-state breweries. They look at the consumption in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And they want to get in,
but
it's such a hard market. If you're not ingrained in the culture here,
right? I
feel like it's a really hard sell.
It totally is, and you see so many of them come and go.
Yeah,
that's the thing. It's it looks like a really great market, and like was mentioned before, people come in and they'll buy it once, maybe twice, but then they'll return to the novelty wears off, and they're just not interested anymore. And you see those brands just all of a sudden they're on the discount shelf, and then you don't see them anymore. It just kind of floats away.
Yeah, I think about when we first opened. We opened in 2015. You would see Ballast Point all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
That was and then Lagunitas was big. And,
right. I
remember
when New Belgium came in.
Yes.
And they had that deal where they only sold it in bombers and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yeah,
and where are those breweries?
Right. It's funny. You mentioned Oshkosh Brewing Company. So they at one time they were producing 60,000 barrels.
Yeah, there was a 60,000 barrel a year brewery. And the thing is when that brewery started in 1894. Within 6-7 years, they owned the Oshkosh market.
Sure.
Just owned it, which didn't sit well with the saloon keepers in Oshkosh. So they got together and they started the People's Brewing Company. Now, if that wouldn't have happened, if Oshkosh Brewing Company would have treated those saloon keepers right,
well, they
would have had a 120,000 barrel brewery there,
and they kind of shot themselves in the foot, right? Because
Totally.
they started to jack their prices up.
Yeah, they treated these guys terribly.
Yeah.
And not only that, there's just so many stories, and I get in it with some of these books where, they'd have a customer on one corner, and they would have had that customer there for 5-6 years selling their beer, and then the brewery would build a saloon right across the street to compete with this guy, and
crazy.
They did this time and again, and it just got these saloon keepers. So
then the saloon keepers all band together and they start their own brewery.
They banded together and started their own brewery.
Brewery.
Yeah, that's People's Brewing Company, which started in 1913.
And so my understanding was, Oshkosh Brewing Company, you had Chief Oshkosh. right? Which
Yeah,
was like
that started after Prohibition.
After Prohibition,
Yep.
that was kind of a light lager, right?
Yeah, it was a pale lager.
Yeah.
Like your typical sort of like 4.7, 4.8% beer. That beer changed over the years, as all beers do. It started off, it was what was considered a pale lager then, which was maybe more of like
right.
that
Like a
color
Vienna lager,
instead of that straw color that
Yeah.
it later became.
Yeah.
But yeah, and at the end, that beer went right down the tubes.
Sure.
It wasn't a good beer at the end.
It's funny. We have a mutual friend. And I won't share his name because I don't want to embarrass him. But he was telling me a story. He did a clone recipe of Chief Oshkosh, and he was at a homebrew show. And you probably know the story.
I do know this.
and he made the beer. And he's all excited and proud of it, and he gives it to this old timer, and the old timer takes a swig, and he says, "Tastes just like it used to." And the brewer's kind of puffing up his chest, and then the guy says, "Tasted like shit back then, and it still does."
Yeah.
I just love that story. So funny.
Yeah, that's perfect.
But yeah, so you mentioned I didn't realize like with the Oshkosh Brewing, so they sold to Eline, who was like a Schlitz guy,
Yeah, so
kinda.
this story's a little bit complicated, but so David Eline was heir to the Eline family that owned Schlitz. So he got it into his head that he was going to buy the Oshkosh Brewing Company and then immediately turn around and sell it to Schlitz at a profit. It's just a terrible idea. He buys it and then goes to the board of directors and they tell him, get lost.
Right.
We don't need this, 100,000 barrel brewery capacity in Oshkosh.
Yeah,
we're
already
brewing
doing
millions,
Right.
So he comes up here and tries to put a good face on it and just does everything.
And ruin the recipe, right? Like,
Oh.
like started using corn syrup,
Yeah,
malt extracts,
Yeah.
which is funny because like I'll go to brewery shows now, and there's guys like promoting malt extracts.
I know.
It's like
It just goes right-
It's just like what the heck are you doing?
Yeah.
But then I was reading in your book that so he ruins Oshkosh Brewing Company essentially,
That wasn't the last brewery he
and then he goes to Schlitz because he got on the board.
His
right?
father died
Yeah.
in 1967. He takes his father's place in the board of directors at Schlitz, and immediately there's a schism there, and it leads to Schlitz going down the tubes a few years
which is like
later,
one of the biggest falls.
It was the biggest
in
brewery
US
failure
history,
in American
yeah.
history.
I mean, and not just brewery, like company hit. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, Schlitz, in the 50s, they were battling it out with Budweiser or Anheuser-Busch for the biggest brewery in America. I mean, that Schlitz had this long history of being a very big brewery. And, once that older generation passed and it passed on to these younger guys, they had ideas that had nothing to do with quality.
Right.
It was all about, stock market prices
Yeah.
and balance sheets, and they drove it right into the ground.
It's funny because you read about those stories and the same thing happens in our day.
We don't learn.
You don't learn. That's what I love about history. Like whatever history it is. Like I'm a big fan of like Civil War history, World War II history, American history, and man, you read things back and you think like the problems that we're facing today are so unique, but you read about them 100 years ago. They were talking about the same stuff.
It keeps happening, like what do they say? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Yes,
and it's like that. You just see, and especially this is the case with brewing history. You look into brewing history, and it's just these cycles that keep turning and turning.
Sure.
And who knows where we are in that cycle now? I mean, what's kind of interesting about now, if you think about. So there's like 250 craft breweries in Wisconsin right now.
Yeah.
That's about where it was in the 1880s.
Sure.
And that's right before it led to this consolidation where bigger breweries took smaller breweries or they forced the smaller breweries out of the market,
Yep.
I don't know if it can go back that way again, but we'll see. I think we're definitely going to see some tightening, over the next.
Yeah, I think you are seeing that. And I think you could argue though, like Prohibition is probably one of the best things that happened to those breweries that survived, right? Like the bigger breweries.
For the big breweries, yeah.
Yeah, because they survived Prohibition, and then they
well, and they had
they're
when
immediately advantaged.
the end of Prohibition was a mess. This kind of like, it happened fairly quickly, the end, when it came apart. And the legislators hadn't done a good job of getting their ducks in a row prior to it happening. So
Imagine that.
Yeah, imagine. What became the new laws were not very well thought out, and mostly it was written by big breweries. That's why they wanted those tied houses gone.
Oh.
That was part of it. Because if it's a tied house, they can't get in there.
Right.
They weren't the only ones. The
Yeah.
The Anti-Saloon League wanted the tied houses gone as well.
Sure.
But most of the legislation that came out of Prohibition favored the big breweries over the small breweries.
Well, that same thing still happens today. It's
totally.
wild.
Totally. I mean, you look at what's happened with beer law in Wisconsin, and like 2 years ago when we had that thing, it just takes so long to correct this stuff once you've got that stuff in place.
Yeah, it's crazy. So speaking of, go ahead.
No, go.
So speaking of Prohibition, so I was reading in your book, it was funny, like how you said before Prohibition, beer was $7 a barrel, and then it went to $27.50 a barrel.
Yeah.
Because people weren't stopping drinking.
Oh no.
So you just had all these other underground breweries.
Like through here, like when I say through here, I'm thinking Fond du Lac, Winnebago County, Green Lake County. These people were not going to stop drinking. I mean, this was their heritage. This was part of their culture, you know. And there was enough of them there that were, well versed enough in brewing to say, well, we'll start making beer again, our own beer,
Yeah.
So all through this area, you think about like before Prohibition. There's basically 1, 2, 3 in Oshkosh, 2 in Fond du Lac, Waupun, Ripon. So you've got 8, 9 breweries through this area here. During Prohibition, there's probably like 50 Wildcat breweries that operated through these counties, because they just sprung up all over.
And Wildcat was like an outlawed.
Yeah, Wildcat were an outlawed brewery, and they had an interesting way of brewing. So like in Waupun, that brewery shut down, but they kept making wort. So these bootleg beer brewers would go out there, buy wort.
Sure, because you could produce the wort, right?
That was legal.
You could produce, you just couldn't ferment it.
Yeah.
So they were brewing the wort.
And it's funny because I've been lucky enough to come across some resources where guys that were in Oshkosh, bootleggers, let themselves be recorded, and I've got that stuff and
so wait, you actually have talked to the guys that.
So those guys were all dead by the time I got into writing. But 10 years before I started, a guy in Oshkosh got 3 of these guys and had them sat down and they recorded their conversation. Yeah, and I ended up with that.
That's awesome.
It's great. So they would say, they'd go to Waupun, or also the brewery in New London was doing it. They'd go to Waupun, New London, and they''d sign Richard Smith.
Yeah.
Every guy on there would be some Ken Johnson, some name they couldn't trace, and they drive out with trucks, barrels full of wort, and then they'd go to their brewery, they dump it in their fermenter, add the hops, and they're off to the races, and the yeast, and they go.
That's
it was
crazy.
not the hops. The worts were hopped, so it was just yeast, But yeah, there was breweries all over this area, and some of them weren't small, they weren't as big as like, the brewery in Berlin or Bacowden, Fond du Lac, or Haas here, but they would if you look at when they get busted, so that's the only way you really know, because when they get busted,
because they're not going to tell you how much they're making.
But so when they'd get busted, the agents would say, they had 250 barrels on hand of beer ready to go out the door. So you can kind of backwards, work those numbers and see how much they could be doing a year. Some of these breweries were doing like 5,000 barrels a year.
And that's not a small number.
No, that's a lot of beer to me.
Yeah. So you were talking about Frank Youngworth, in your book, one of these. Tell us about.
So Butch Youngworth, Frank Butch Youngworth, was this guy in Oshkosh, and just the typical Southside Oshkosh guy. Grew up in this beer culture. His family had immigrated from Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, and he had never worked in a brewery or done anything related to the saloon trade at all.
Sure.
He was a roofer. But as soon as Prohibition starts, he buys a former bar, turns it into a speakeasy, and starts. There's good money in this stuff, you know. This leads him into becoming a wildcat brewer, and he became. There were two really big bootleggers. You know, they would keep multiple breweries, but there were two really big ones, and Butch was one of those two. And what he would always do is he'd have like typically 2 or 3 breweries in operation, you know, and the two of them or one, you know, would just be sitting kind of idle.
Sure.
But then if one got busted, the one that was producing all the beer, they'd immediately start production in one of the other.
There.
Yeah, he always kept it rolling like that, you know. And in Oshkosh, you know, Oshkosh was different, you know, because like even the mayor, as soon as Prohibition started in Oshkosh, he said, "We're not enforcing this."
Yeah, the cops were pretty like they would enforce everything else but
nothing to do.
Prohibition,
They
right?
wanted nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
You know, and you know if. In Oshkosh, you know, where the police come from, they're coming out of those neighborhoods.
The same neighborhoods, yeah.
Right, where the corner bar is an establishment.
Yeah.
They're not going to go in and start busting their buddies and family members and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So, yeah, it just, Prohibition was totally unacceptable for people in Oshkosh. So the only time guys like Butch Youngworth would get busted is when the feds came to town.
Sure.
You know, and from time to time they would. You know, they'd come into Oshkosh, they'd come rolling in, and they'd make a bunch of arrests, and then they wouldn't be back for a year or so.
Sure.
So in the meantime, it was just a wide open city. You know, there were just on Main Street, there were probably 20 speakeasies on Main Street. You know,
That's hilarious.
And not only that, so the other thing is like, you know, I said like at these breweries like at New London or Waupun, they were making work for bootleggers.
Yeah.
Like at the Oshkosh Brewing Company, they immediately started making homebrew stuff. So, you know, they would make malt extract.
Yep.
And everyone would go to the brewery and buy their malt extract.
And
you
then
know?
wouldn't they even print like directions?
Oh yeah, well,
like or say like, don't add hops to this, and don't.
Miller would do that. Like,
Okay, Miller
did that too, and they would say, "This is for baking purposes." The Oshkosh ones were a little more subtle, I guess.
Sure.
So they would have like, you know, on the label, they'd have a woman walking around with a plate full of brownies or something. So it wasn't supposed. But meanwhile, it says dark hopped malt extract. You don't
What's in
want
the
hops
brownies?
in your
Yeah, you don't want
brownie.
hops
You
in
know,
the brownies.
it's good for one thing. You know, one thing only. So it's like the idea that anyone was doing anything other than making beer with that. But you know, like at one point in Oshkosh, there were 2 homebrew stores. You know, during Prohibition.
Sure.
The first one was started by this woman who Anna Winhauser, who has just a crazy story. She came from Green Bay, where her husband. This is during Prohibition. Her husband had become an alcoholic during Prohibition, and she's like, "I'm getting out of here." So she takes the kids, moves to Oshkosh, and opens a homebrew store.
homebrew.
Opens a homebrew store, and she does very, very well. You know?
Because what she was selling probably wasn't illegal, correct?
So this was like a real gray area when Prohibition started.
Sure.
But by like 1922, everyone had given up on this. It's like there's no way to regulate this.
Yeah.
So yeah, she sold everything.
She sold all the ingredients. She just wasn't.
She sold
making.
kegging equipment. She sold bottling equipment. She sold malt extract. She sold hops. She sold everything you needed to make beer.
That is crazy.
Yeah. And it was a big store.
Yeah.
You know.
Were any of these guys like tied down, like to Chicago? Like were any of them producing beer and shipping it like to Capone or anything, or not?
No,
Not really?
like the beer was local.
Yeah.
But there were some people making whiskey and stuff like that
Yeah.
that did have some connections to
Okay.
Chicago. Yeah. I've heard stories about Capone, but I think those are maybe
Made
a little
up, yeah.
fabulous. You know, I think sometimes people go to that a little too quickly without. You
Yeah.
know. But there was some connection between Oshkosh and Chicago as far as liquor, and Fond du Lac too. Fond du Lac had a big liquor moonshine thing.
Really?
Yeah, and a lot of that was going down to the Chicago
Was
area.
41 still? Was that a road?
Yeah, but it wasn't like that.
Right, obviously. yeah. But it was a
Yeah,
direct
definitely.
Okay.
And I've got this one story about a guy in Oshkosh who his name was Slim Suda, Slim, who had to make trips from time to time down to Chicago. He was mostly into beer, but every now and then he'd have to run liquor down there, moonshine. He hated it.
Sure.
Because the reputation of those guys down there was so bad. He always thought he was going to get shot or something.
Yeah.
You know, he said he'd be trembling when he get down there. But mostly, I mean, the beer was mostly beer's so heavy, and you know.
Yeah, and it's hard to transport. Yeah.
But so beer was mostly a local product.
Got
you
it.
know.
Interesting.
Yeah. This area around here was there's just so many moonshine distilleries and stuff. I mean, they were all over the place, you know, and they'd be on farms, you know, they'd be in warehouses, you know, and periodically they get busted. But, you know, I would guess for everyone that got busted, there was 5 that kept going, you know.
Fine.
Yeah.
And were a lot of people doing that? I mean, were they doing it like to make money? I mean, obviously some guys like Youngworth, were they all doing it to make money, or were some of them just doing it to?
Yeah, because I mean, like Frank Youngworth, you know, he was a roofer before that.
Yeah.
And he got by. He had, you know, before you know it, he had like 9 kids, as these families tend to do.
Yeah.
But you know, he could get by on that, but it wasn't like the kind of money he'd make through bootleg. I mean, at one point, he was making close to $1 million. In today's money, it would be close to $1 million a year on bootleg beer.
Yeah.
You know, and I've talked to relatives of his grandchildren and things like that, and he spent all of it.
Yeah.
You know, he couldn't.
Easy come, easy go.
He's a big gambler, you know, big time operator sort of dude.
Did he ever get busted?
He never personally got busted, but plenty of his. So he had this setup. He kept himself insulated, you know.
Sure.
So, but he had to deal with a lot of these people that, okay, if you get busted, and I'll pay the fine, you know. So the brewery would be not on properties he owned.
Sure.
It would be on somebody else's.
And they would deed it to someone else, right?
Yeah.
So there was no connection.
No connection to him at all. So he said, okay, you get busted, I'll pay your fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
If you get busted with above a certain limit, and it ends up being a jail term, I'll pay your salary while you're in jail, and I'll keep your family, you know.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were willing to make that deal, you know.
Sure.
Because part of the thing is, you know, in all these cities around here, lesser and greater degrees in some places, but there was no stigma about this.
Sure.
This is where
it was just like, it was the culture. It was
right, and this is
they
where
were all
like
against it. Yeah.
lawlessness becomes completely acceptable for people because they just despise this law, you know, and they're not gonna pretend they don't, you know.
Yeah.
So, like, there's a case in Oshkosh where this saloon owner started a bootleg brewery in the basement of his saloon, you know. 2 years later, he's elected to the Oshkosh Common Council. You know, it's not like anyone cared, you know, so what? It wasn't even brought up when he's running, you know. So, yeah, it was...
well, there was no internet back then.
There was no internet. But I'll tell you, you know, their names were all over the paper every time, you know, they got busted. They just live with it. But that's a thing where that history gets kind of hard because people didn't want to talk about it later. You know, after it all transpired, a lot of people went to jail. A lot of people, you know, got arrested. They weren't necessarily, they weren't proud of it.
They weren't proud of it,
you know.
sure.
So a lot of
it was fine at the time, but...
Yeah, a lot of these stories just fall away, which is really a shame because it's to me it's one of the most colorful pieces of history that Wisconsin has you know, during Prohibition.
So then we come out of Prohibition, and in Oshkosh we still got Oshkosh Brewing,
Oshkosh Brewing,
Peoples, and we haven't talked much about Peoples, but Peoples they didn't go like the light lager route as much, right? Like they still had some maltier beer.
Yeah, they did. I mean, they were producing what would be now like a Helles. You know, it was a malty, rich German, you know, Bavarian style beer. But like, so when Prohibition ended, one of the things they did. So let's go back to Ripon here. When Prohibition ended, you know, the Ripon, what was Haas Brewing Company became the Ripon Brewing Company.
Okay.
And
speaking of Haas, I got to show you my
go.
mug. So this is John Haas from the Haas Brewery, which you probably know a lot more than I do, but a very dear lady, a customer of mine, gave me this. She was a caretaker for, I don't remember but it was like somehow the lady she was caretaking, she was like 100, but she was kind of she was a Haas, or she was related to the family.
Okay, cool.
And so she had some things, and she gave me this because now we're the Ripon Brewery.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, and this guy on here is almost as big as John Haas. Not quite, but
Yeah.
John
Yeah.
Haas was a very large man. But yeah, Haas started. So like, we'll get back to the post-prohibition thing, but like, you might find this interesting. So Haas wasn't the first brewery in Ripon. There was
Really?
No,
I didn't know that.
There was a guy named William Pearson, but he brewed all ale.
Okay.
And
which was different for the time, right? Because
Yeah.
everybody was moving towards lager.
Yeah, and it all depends, like, where the Germans went to first. So, like in Oshkosh, that was a big German center, and it was lager right from the jump.
Sure.
But in a lot of other areas, like Markesan had a brewery that made ale.
Okay.
They were all over.
Yeah.
Fond du Lac had a couple of them. But the first brewery in Ripon was this guy named William Pearson, and he started in 1856. I've seen ads from him from like 1860, and it's funny because he's like Stout, the national beverage. So he's brewing Stout. I just love that idea that Stout's the national beverage.
Awesome. Yeah.
But yeah, so then Haas started in 1865, I believe.
Okay.
And he was the typical prototypical German
more
brewer. He had been
traditional,
around. He had brewed in Fond du Lac. He brewed in a number of places before he started here in Ripon. And that brewery did well.
Long time, right? So
Yeah.
65 they started.
1865, it did well right up until Prohibition, and then they they tried doing near beer and stuff like that, and didn't work out. So they shut down through most of Prohibition.
Okay.
1933, Prohibition ends. They start right back up, and they started doing something kind of interesting. So they started. The field was wide open at this point, and in the early days, like I said before, they really didn't have their stuff worked out prior to Prohibition ending. So it was a no man's land as far as what the laws were going to be.
Yeah.
So at Haas's brewery, which became the Ripon Brewing Company, they started making this thing called Old Derby. And it was a 12% beer. And like, I've got these ads for saloons selling it.
Yeah.
10 cents. I mean, I don't know how those nights ended.
Oh man, not good.
No.
Yeah.
So they were selling Old Derby. They were also brewing porter, and
Okay.
and they're just trying to. Nobody knew what was going to happen.
Right. So they're throwing everything out.
Yeah, and I mean, Ripon Brewing Company was distributing that porter out to Colorado. They were sending that beer all over.
How would they get it?
They
Was
had
it rail?
Yeah, rail or trucks. Yeah,
Okay.
probably actually rail.
Yeah,
you're probably right. But yeah, they were distributing it out there. But you want to go
So
ahead?
you had the Haas Brewery here in Ripon,
Which became Ripon Brewing Company.
which
Yep.
became Ripon, and then you had. I've always been intrigued kind of by the Berlin Brewing Company because I used to live in Berlin.
Yeah.
And there's still some structures up there that are kind
Yeah,
of cool.
yeah. I mean, that brewery, like, that was your typical farmer's brewery.
Okay.
So they all those areas around there that where you'd have these roadhouse taverns and saloons
Yeah.
and stuff that were basically farmer kind of places.
Yeah.
They'd have Berlin beer on, and they did very well. I mean, at one point they were producing about 45,000 barrels a year.
I read that. And they were just mostly selling to this local market, right?
Yeah, I mean,
that's a lot of beer.
When things started going bad for them, so they closed in '64. When things started going bad for them, they started trying to do this thing, that you do, where they'd send the beer to Kenosha and sell it for $2 a case.
Yeah.
And people would buy
They're
it once.
losing money.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're basically trading dollars on it, and
Yeah.
and that's always the death knell,
Right.
For these breweries when they get there. But yeah, I mean, they had a really interesting history. Berlin itself, I mean, Green Lake County had 6 breweries.
Yeah.
4.
Princeton, right?
Well, there were which one?
Princeton, the Tiger Brewery.
Yeah.
Yep.
And there were 4 right around Berlin, and I'm blanking.
Markesan?
Markesan,
Yeah.
was the other one.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was always these areas all had this beer culture. They were all doing it. I want to get back to Old Derby though.
Sure.
So when Ripon was brewing this Old Derby, this 10% beer. So then when all of a sudden they got the laws, where they needed to be, and that you couldn't really, you'd have to call it like a malted liquor. It was a weird.
Okay.
It wasn't like malt liquor.
You couldn't
now,
call
but-
it beer anymore.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they stopped it and made it like a 5%.
Yeah.
Actually, I think it was a little stronger than that. I think it was like 5.5 or 6. Still like a stronger beer, but it wasn't that 12% beer that they had rolled out, you know. So when Ripon Brewing Company closed in 37, People's Brewing Company bought those brands.
Oh.
And People's Brewing Company started making Old Derby, and they kept making Old Derby until 1950.
That makes sense, because I saw in your book that People's Brewery had an Old Derby ale, and I remember you and I talked a long time ago that Ripon Brewery had an Old Derby ale. Okay.
Yeah.
And so People's kind of, so they're doing well up through the 60s, right?
Yeah.
Even 70s?
Yeah, People's, I mean, so in the 60s for everybody, things start falling off, because that's when you've got more these national breweries really starting to
They're hammering them.
We want these markets.
Yeah.
You know, we want everything.
Yeah.
And the advertising was really starting to hit these breweries. So people.
Well, you had TV was getting more popular.
Yeah,
right?
and they're advertising on baseball and boxing, all this stuff. You know, People's did really well. I mean, I shouldn't say really well, but they were doing well enough. It was still a profitable brewery. But in 1970, this group from Milwaukee came up to buy that brewery. There's a long story behind this group. It was led by Theodore Mack. It's a black man from Milwaukee. And this group that he led, they were into black entrepreneurship, and they wanted to have a brewery, and they tried buying Blatz. Initially, they could never get the money for that.
Right.
So,
and this is a big deal, like in the 70s, right?
Oh yeah, it's a very big deal.
Yeah.
And you know, Oshkosh at that point, the black population is probably 2%, 1%. It's you know, very few black people living there. So he and this group buy that brewery, People's Brewing Company, which up until that time had still been a cooperative brewery. They had to change the charter of it to make this happen, because the deal is nobody could own more than 10% of the stock.
Oh, okay.
Because when all these saloon,
because it was all the saloon keepers
got together, they did
like
that.
A co-op.
So he ends up getting the brewery, and then the Milwaukee Sentinel, who knows why, published an article saying that his plan is to come up to Oshkosh and fire all the white workers.
Sure.
So you know how well that is going to go over.
Yeah.
So immediately,
which wasn't his plan.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. All these taverns in Oshkosh start taking the beer off.
Sure.
Mac moves to Oshkosh, moves his family here, and he's does a great job of going around and like saying these are lies. This is not true. It's not what we intend to do. And shortly, he gets the brewery back on track, and before long, they're selling more beer in Oshkosh than they had before his arrival there.
He became kind of a local celebrity.
Oh, totally. Yeah. He was everywhere. And they were selling a lot of beer in Ripon too.
Okay.
I mean, all through this area.
I have a customer actually. He's close to 90, but he used to drink People's Brewery, and his dad would drink People's Brewery.
Yep.
And they lived in Ripon.
Yep.
And he would get. I think he said he would get like a case of beer delivered to his house every week.
Sure.
Just like kind of like getting the milk.
That was kind of a norm.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, they sold a lot of beer out here, but his plan, what they didn't want just a regional brewery.
Sure.
What they wanted to do is like hit these urban markets and come in and say, listen, we're black businessmen, support, and go into places like Milwaukee, Memphis, Gary, Indiana, Los Angeles, Chicago, and say, support us,
Yeah.
And they could never make it work.
Just didn't work.
Yeah.
Once you get just like the same old story, right? You get too far out,
and the thing is, they never had enough money to actually present themselves in these other markets.
Sure.
They couldn't advertise well enough. They didn't have the cash for it.
Yeah.
So, people would see this beer there. They didn't know what it was.
Right.
Maybe a few people did, but not enough to really make a go of it.
Yeah.
And all that money that they put out there and the money they put in the brewery, within 2 years, they just completely ran out. They had no cash left. They had no cash flow. So that's what killed that brewery. But once again, it's that situation where you leave that local market and you start focusing on places that they don't really know or care about you.
Yeah.
And it ain't going to work.
It gets tough.
Yeah.
You even had a spot in there about contract brewing, which I've always found interesting. Like Needham, you said Needham Brewery was contract brewing, and just a terrible idea. Right?
Yeah. Well, that was especially a terrible idea. I mean, I think there can be sometimes a place where that might work.
Right.
But they were brewing. So the Neenah Brewery started brewing their beer at the Walter Brothers Brewery in Menasha.
Yeah,
so your main competition is brewing your beer. This is not a good sign for your business.
Not a good setup.
Yeah. Actually, and there have been other, so I don't know if some people watching this might remember Chief Oshkosh Red Lager, which came out in the 1990s. That was a guy from Oshkosh who wanted to kind of revive that brand.
Yeah.
And he brewed that up in Point.
Sure.
Yeah, and actually he did pretty well for a while.
Did well, right?
Yeah,
Good.
and
And then you said Leinenkugels.
Leinenkugels.
Right, which is one of my favorite beers of theirs, you know.
They saw how
Yeah.
well he was doing, so they said, okay, we're going to do red lager.
Yeah.
And they went market by market where he was succeeding.
Unbelievable.
And, you know, he can never compete on price
Yeah.
with those guys.
No.
That was Miller-owned Leinenkugels
Yeah.
at that point. So, yeah.
It's cutthroat.
It's a tough
business.
It
But it's
always has
fun.
been. Yeah.
It's there's nothing like being the beer guy.
Well, I'll tell you, like, I've been really lucky to get to know not just brewers present day, but some brewers from the past. You know, one guy I got to know was Wilhelm Koloff. So he was born in Germany, learned how to brew there, and later on came to Oshkosh and then brewed for Peoples.
Okay.
You know, and when I met him, he was living in an assisted living facility, and he was 90 years old. You know, and you know, I come up to him. It's just a happenstance. Somebody read some stuff of mine and said, "Have you met this guy?" I'm like, "I didn't know this guy was alive.
Sure.
I need to meet this guy." So it was arranged for me to meet him, and I go meet him, and I could just tell, like, initially, he's like, "What is wrong with you? Why do you care?"
Sure.
You know. But then once we started talking about beer, he just lit up.
Yeah.
You know, and so I just asked him, I was like, "Do you remember the recipe for Peoples?" He, you know, this is 40 years later.
He's got it in his head.
Actually, yeah, it was more than that even. He just recited it off the top of his head, you know. And then we meet later. He brings all his handwritten notes. Some of it's half in German, half in English. I'm like, "Wilhelm, what is that word?"
Yeah.
But it's like, you get to meet people like that, and it's like, God, it's just unreal. I got to meet Charles Rahr IV, who was the last brewer at the Rahr Brewing Company. It was a really same situation. It's like, when I first met him, he's like, "What do you want?"
Yeah.
You know? And then once you start talking about beer, it all turns around, and it's like just a great guy.
There's just something about beer, I think.
Yeah, I
And
think so too.
The culture, the history. You know, we just had Polka Fest, and I mean, they're just, I don't know, people just come out like to have beer and polkas. And,
Well,
you know,
yeah, when you're putting beer and polka together,
it's just,
now you're like tearing at the heart of Wisconsin.
Yeah,
right
it's
there.
magical. So,
Yeah.
No, it's thank you for all that you do, and
No problem.
thanks for coming on.
No problem.
It's been awesome.
It's great.
You're welcome
Thank you.
back anytime, and
All right. Well, you just let me
next
know.
time you should bring some of your beers so I can.
Okay, I will do that. Do you remember the first time we talked? I was thinking about this.
Well, I think it was 2019.
I think it's 2017.
Oh wait, no, you're right, because you helped me get on tap at Peabody's.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I think you came out and I
shot
think
a
I
video.
showed you. Yeah, we
Yeah.
shot a video. Showed you the brewery over there.
Yeah.
And then
and you had that. You still were on that half barrel system.
we were on the half barrel
Yeah.
because we opened in 2015, but we were on that half barrel system for about a little over a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So just think. I mean, 10 years.
10 years.
10 years.
Goes
Now
by
here you
quick.
are. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dave.
Cheers.
Prost.
Thanks for watching, folks. See you again.